All right, so what we're going to begin looking at here is kind of picking up where we left off and talking about how we change the volume of our thoracic cavity to aid in ventilation, right? So this law called Boyle's law, this is describing the relationship between volume and pressure, right? So this relationship is inverse, meaning as one increases, the other decreases, right? So the relationship here is as we increase the volume of our thoracic cavity, we will have a lower pressure of air in that same space, in the thoracic cavity. As we decrease the volume, we'll increase the pressure, right? So if you look at this kind of graph here in this bottom left, whenever we have a very high, large volume, this corresponds to a low pressure. And when we have a low volume, a small volume, this corresponds to a higher pressure, right? And so with this, the way that we change the volume is through those activities that we just discussed, right? So maybe that bucket handle analogy, maybe the pump handle analogy, right? If you want to visualize it other than a graph, you can visualize it in this more kind of realistic example, right? So if you push a plunger down into a closed space, as you decrease the volume, right, you're increasing the pressure. As you have an increased volume, you have a decreased pressure, right? And so the way we do this is by changing the shape of the diaphragm, which changes the shape of the size of the lungs, which is ultimately going to influence the movement of air, right? So the way you actually get the movement of air is as you change the volume, you change the pressure. You have to create what's called a pressure gradient, right? So the pressure gradient here is describing an area of high pressure moving to an area of low pressure, right? So here we've got high pressure, here we've got low pressure, right? So a large area here, so low pressure, I'm sorry, I may have said that backwards. So low pressure here, high pressure here, right? Based on the size, based on the changes in the um, or the difference in the size of the containers, right? So again, smaller volume, higher pressure, larger volume, lower pressure. Okay, so whenever we are actually moving gas, right? When we're moving air, it is moving from these areas of high pressure to low pressure. Okay, um, and so our whole ventilation process is dependent on understanding and knowing which pressure is higher than or less than another, and how do you change the pressures in those different areas, right? And so one pressure in particular is called the atmospheric pressure, right? This is the pressure around us, right? At sea level, it's 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Um, Now, you may also see, depending on kind of what your sources that you're looking at and how they have it formatted, is you may just see atmospheric pressure referred to as zero. Okay, zero meaning this is kind of our baseline, right? Baseline means it's our reference point, if you will, right? So if you see atmospheric pressure labeled as zero, anything that is negative is lower than atmospheric pressure, and anything that is positive is higher or greater than atmospheric pressure. Okay, so we're not directly changing atmospheric pressure, right? You can be in different locations, right? So in terms of geographical locations, different altitudes, that will change the air pressure, but we ourselves are not changing the atmospheric pressure, right? Um, we have our alveolar volume, which is the amount of alveoli in our lung. And so the pressure in this space, in the alveoli, is going to be the intrapulmonary pressure, right? You may also see this called intraalveolar. All this is, it's the pressure of the air in the lung, right? So in the alveoli. Now at rest, the intrapulmonary pressure is going to equalize with atmospheric. So they're going to be the same, right? Whenever we begin the process of inhaling and begin the process of exhaling, we're going to change these volumes, right? Or I'm sorry, we're going to change these pressures by changing the volumes, right? So it's going to fluctuate. Another major pressure is called intrapleural, right? Intrapleural is the pressure of the air within the pleural cavity. So remember, the pleural cavity is the space between the parietal and visceral pleura, and it's going to be negative, right? It's going to be negative. Always, this is important. The negative intrapleural pressure is going to assist in keeping the lungs inflated, right? So if you have some type of damage to the lung or the thoracic wall, there's a perforation, a stab wound, a gunshot wound, something that opens up and destroys and interrupts that intrapleural pressure, and it's no longer negative, then you can end up with a collapsed lung, right? So this is what happens in things like a pneumothorax, things like that, right? Now, this is usually 4 millimeters of mercury less than atmospheric, okay? So it's denoted as -4, right? So -4, -4, 4 millimeters of mercury below atmospheric pressure, right? So if we want to move gases, we have to change some of these pressures, right? And so we'll look at some of these here, right? So this is showing intrapleural pressure, intrapulmonary, and then we can see atmospheric, right? Again, notice atmospheric and intrapulmonary are the same, right? So we'll just call them 0, right? Intrapleural, 756, that's where we get the -4 from, right? So meaning it is 4 millimeters of mercury less than atmospheric and intrapulmonary, right? So when it is time for us to then begin the process of ventilation, so we want to breathe in, we want to breathe out, we want to inhale, we want to exhale, we're going to change these pressures, right? So on the left here, you see quiet inspiration. So we're bringing air in, right? So here we're bringing air in. We have 760, right? And think about what muscle is going to contract, right? So our diaphragm is going to contract. When the diaphragm contracts, it's going to ultimately increase the size of the thoracic cavity, right? So the thoracic cavity, the ribs are going to move out and up, right? The sternum is going to move forward. On the inside of the thoracic cavity, right? Remember, you have that parietal pleura. The parietal pleura attached to the thoracic wall is pulled with the thoracic wall. Adhered and kind of attached to the parietal pleura, you have the visceral pleura, right? Remember, there's a little bit of serous fluid in between. And then the visceral pleura is on the surface of the lung, right? So as the thoracic wall moves, it's moving the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura is essentially adhered to the parietal pleura, and the visceral pleura is attached to the lung. So in other words, as the thoracic wall expands, the lung is being pulled with it, right? So it's not the air rushing into the lung that makes the lung inflate. It's the lungs getting larger that causes the air to move in, right? So as those things happen, right, the lung ultimately gets larger. What's the relationship between volume and pressure, right? As you increase the volume, what happens to the pressure? It decreases, right? So now we've decreased the pressure such that the intrapulmonary pressure is lower than the atmospheric pressure, right? So now air can move from the atmosphere into the lung because it's going from high pressure to low pressure, right? Through that pressure gradient, right? So we're going from a higher atmospheric pressure, 760, to a lower intrapulmonary, 759, 758, something like that, right? So it's more negative on the inside, right? So air is now rushing in, right? It will continue to move in until the intrapulmonary and the atmospheric equalize again, right? They kind of re-equalize. At this point, then you get to the point of expiration, right? So now you exhale. So you essentially relax the same muscles that we just contracted. So relax the diaphragm, relax the external intercostals. This is then going to allow the chest cavity to recoil, right? Which is going to push on the lungs and cause them to get smaller. So the volume of the lung decreases. So what happens to the pressure? The pressure increases, right? So now if the pressure is increasing in the lung, the pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure, or that intraalveolar pressure in the lung, is now greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. So air moves from high pressure to low pressure out of the lung, right? So it's the same basic process in both directions, just changes in what's happening to the muscles, what's happening to the volumes, and what's happening to the pressures, right? But the principles are the same. When you change the volume, you change the pressure. When you change the pressure, you create a pressure gradient, and air is going to move down the gradient. Air will always flow down the gradient, right? Either into the lung or out of the lung. When it's into the lung, that's inspiration. When it flows down the gradient out of the lung, that's expiration, right? So this is what's happening with quiet breathing, right? When you get to forced breathing, you have basically the same things happening, right? You're still changing volumes, you're still changing pressures, you still have movement of air, Air is still moving from high pressure to low pressure. The difference here is what muscles you're contracting to change the volume and thus change the pressure, and then the actual raw values for the pressure changes, right? So you get larger changes in volume, so you get larger changes in pressure, so you get more air movement, right? So you end up moving more air in and out of the lungs when you're forced breathing, so labored breathing. So again, think after exercise, something like that. If after you've just sprinted, you're moving more air in and out of your lungs than you are when you are quiet breathing, right? But the concepts, the principles are exactly the same. It's just the raw figures, the overall change in volume, the overall change in pressure, and the total movement of air is more exaggerated, right? And again, think of what those muscles are that are helping with both inhalation and exhalation when it's forced breathing, right? So let's stop here. We'll pick up in our next part and we'll begin talking about how we control breathing through our nervous system.